My background is a combination of politics, policy, public service and private sector work. I've worked for the Minister for the Sydney Olympic Games as the Construction and Transport Policy Advisor. I worked in the state rail system, looking at the future construction and rail development program. I then came back as the Chief of Staff to Morris Yemma, who became the Minister for Health, and ultimately after that the Premier of New South Wales, where I served under him as the Chief Policy Advisor. My view is it's up to politicians to show leadership. It's up to industry leaders to show leadership, to not shy away from difficult decisions like the need for quality high-rise development, but to demonstrate that there are bonuses and benefits that can be had for all of the community through that. We can protect the integrity of our suburbs by having high-rise built in the right place, like, for example, around transport nodes. There's no doubt that Chris Johnson was an outstanding leading figure for the Urban Taskforce over the last 8 years. Chris is somebody who has an enormous reputation as the former Chief Government Architect, but also as a leader in architectural design in the City of Sydney and beyond. I'm not going to replace that aspect of Chris Johnson. There's no way I could hope to do that. I'll bring new skills to the Urban Taskforce. I'll bring my own background, which is a combination of politics, policy, government sector work, private sector work, and the experience of developers in the development industry from all perspectives to the task of Chief Executive. With that background and experience, I think I can bring a broad perspective and accordingly can shape up policies to deal with the challenges that we have. It's not going to diminish in any way. In fact, if anything, the focus on people's amenity, people's suburbs, the look and feel and shape, the enjoyment and the happiness of people in their living environment, the focus on those important things is going to grow, not shrink. You've seen some real challenges for the development industry recently with the likes of Opal Tower and Mascot. It's always the case that the 2% make it difficult for the 98%, and indeed the 98% are doing an outstanding job, and the Urban Taskforce members in particular represent the top end of that 98%. That said, we can't ignore the fact that there's some harsh criticisms going on out there, and there's a lot of people who believe that the criticisms are real and justified. We can't lie about the situation and say that there aren't some problems. We can highlight the fact that those problems are relatively rare, that there are 450 cranes out there in Sydney at the moment building high-rise developments and they're not falling over. Housing supply is one of the critical factors in determining housing price. At the moment, the planning system in Sydney is delivering peaks and troughs in housing supply. Sometimes you get a whole lot of approvals and then there's a bit of a community backlash and the flow of housing just dries up. That causes enormous economic problems. Now, we have two problems, and these come down to a fundamental economic base. One is we have very cheap money as a result of the very low interest rates, a strong desire from the federal government and the Reserve Bank to stimulate the economy with very low interest rates. That means money's relatively cheap for people to borrow. On the other hand, we're getting to a position where we have restricted supply. Restricted supply, as everyone knows, will push prices up. If you have a situation where there is both restricted supply and cheap money, we're looking at house prices going through the roof. The New South Wales Government's recent commitment to transport infrastructure is a massive boom for the New South Wales and Sydney economies. It is the catalyst to the release of new land areas for development. It is the catalyst for the redevelopment of older areas, particularly industrial areas, which are no longer used for high levels of industrial employment because no longer do we have the need for the large factories that once upon a time dominated the industrial areas of Sydney. Those areas themselves can be transformed into mixed-use developments with higher levels of relevant employment for the people of today. Those areas can also be transformed to house people, because I would like nothing more than to see greater housing density next to and around new transport-oriented developments. The frustration I have is with the detail of the planning system at the moment. There's too much focus on things which aren't producing quality outcomes. In fact, in many respects, the level of regulation is working against the delivery of quality outcomes. It's forcing a ticker box mentality amongst planners rather than a merit-based planning assessment system. I want to see a system of planning that goes back to a merit-based approval process rather than a ticker box and produce an average planning system. Sometimes that's the case here in Sydney, and particularly in the CBD, there are some outstanding examples. Sometimes, as was recently seen in relation to the Independent Planning Commission's rejection of the Ritz-Carlton Hotel at Piermont, the opposite is the case. A few people get together and object, a couple of views are blocked, and $750 million worth of development is scrapped despite an international architectural competition and an outstanding potential contribution to the development of the Piermont precinct as the extension of Sydney.